A few years ago, I worked administrative support at a regional medical center outside Portland, Oregon. The hospital was large enough that you could spend months working there and still discover hallways you'd never seen before. Most departments were spread across multiple wings, connected by service corridors and restricted access elevators. My office was located in a lower-level records section that sat beneath the main treatment floors. It wasn't exactly isolated, but it always felt disconnected from the rest of the building. The records department occupied an area that had originally been designed for storage decades earlier. Over time, renovations transformed it into office space, though parts of the original layout remained unchanged. The ceilings were lower than the rest of the hospital, and some corridors ended in locked utility rooms. Because of its location, cell phone reception was inconsistent, and announcements often sounded muffled through the ceiling speakers. Most employees joked that working down there felt like being in a completely separate building. One afternoon, our department was finishing quarterly archive reviews. It was repetitive work involving paperwork, digital records, and enough filing to make the hours blur together. Around 2 o'clock, I wrapped up my assignments earlier than expected and messaged a coworker named Gregor. Gregor worked in another office a short distance away, on the same lower level. Neither of us had much left to do before the end of the shift. A few minutes later, I walked over to his office. We started talking about weekend plans, upcoming vacations, and anything else that could make the afternoon move faster. The lower level was unusually quiet that day, with fewer employees moving through the halls than normal. Outside the office door, the corridor sat empty except for a maintenance cart parked near a corner. Everything felt completely routine. Then Gregor checked his phone. An emergency alert had been sent to hospital staff. The message instructed everyone to remain where they were until further notice, due to a security concern somewhere in the facility. At first, neither of us thought much about it, because occasional emergency procedures happened a few times each year. Usually, they were precautionary and ended quickly without affecting daily operations. Still, it was enough to make us pause and look at each other. The timing felt odd because we hadn't heard any overhead announcement. A minute passed, then another. The speakers remained silent. Gregor eventually shrugged and suggested we walk toward the main corridor to see what was happening. I agreed, mostly because curiosity got the better of us. The alert hadn't provided details, and neither of us wanted to spend the next hour guessing. We figured we'd take a quick look and return if anything seemed unusual. At the time, it felt like a harmless decision. The moment we stepped into the main hallway, I shivered, but I could tell it wasn't from cold. It was from instinct. The corridor lights had been dimmed, leaving large sections noticeably darker than usual. Most office doors were closed, and the normally busy lower level seemed completely deserted. Even the constant background noise of printers, conversations, and equipment felt absent. The silence was what bothered me most. We continued toward a stairwell connecting the lower level to the administrative floors above. As we approached the intersection, Gregor slowed down and grabbed my arm. At first, I thought he had heard something. Instead, he pointed down the corridor toward the loading access hallway. Someone was standing there. The figure remained motionless. The distance made it difficult to see details clearly. For a moment, I assumed it was another employee waiting for instructions. But as the person started walking toward us, it became obvious something was off. The clothing didn't resemble a uniform, badge, or visitor pass. Whoever it was, clearly didn't belong in a restricted employee area. Neither of us spoke. We simply turned around and walked back the way we came. At first, we tried not to appear nervous. Then we heard footsteps behind us, steady and deliberate. That was enough to make us pick up our pace considerably. By the time we reached the office section again, neither of us cared about looking calm anymore. We just wanted somewhere secure. The nearest room happened to be an unused file storage office. We slipped inside and quietly shut the door behind us. The room contained rows of empty shelving and stacks of old archive boxes waiting for disposal. There were no windows and only a single entrance. The overhead lights remained off as we stood listening in complete darkness. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then the footsteps returned. They were much closer now. The sound echoed through the hallway directly outside the room. Whoever had been following us appeared to be moving slowly between office doors. Every few moments, the footsteps would stop before starting again. It sounded less like someone walking somewhere and more like someone searching. That realization immediately raised my anxiety. Gregor pulled out his phone and started typing a message to hospital security. Before he could finish, the footsteps stopped completely. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. Neither of us could tell whether the person had left or was standing directly outside the door. We waited without saying a word. A few moments later, the door handle moved. Not violently, just enough to confirm someone was trying it. The handle shifted once, then again. Neither of us moved. Thankfully, the door was locked. After several seconds, the movement stopped. We listened carefully, expecting footsteps retreating down the hallway. Instead, there was nothing. No sound at all. The person remained completely silent. That lasted nearly a full minute. Then came a soft knock. 3 slow taps against the door. Gregor and I stared at each other in disbelief. Something about the calmness of it felt deeply unsettling. A person trying to locate help would probably speak. A staff member would identify themselves. Whoever stood outside did neither. Another knock followed, then another. The same slow rhythm every time. Eventually, a voice spoke from the hallway. "Security." Neither of us moved. The voice repeated the word again. Neither of us recognized the voice, and there was no accompanying radio traffic. The silence afterward made the claim feel even less believable. We stayed exactly where we were. A few minutes later, a message arrived on Gregor's phone. Security had received his earlier alert. The response instructed us to remain inside and informed us that officers were already searching the lower level. That confirmation instantly validated our instincts. Whoever stood outside earlier was definitely not security. For the first time, the situation felt genuinely serious. We remained in that dark room for nearly 40 minutes. Occasionally, distant sounds echoed through the corridor. At one point, we heard multiple voices communicating over radios. Later, several doors opened and closed somewhere nearby. The tension gradually eased. Eventually, a verified security officer unlocked the door and escorted us out. The security protocol was lifted shortly afterward. According to staff briefings released later, an unauthorized individual had somehow gained access through a service entrance undergoing maintenance. The person had wandered through several restricted sections of the hospital before security teams located them. No injuries occurred, and the situation ended peacefully. Even so, the entire incident led to major changes. Access controls, cameras, and monitoring procedures were upgraded across multiple departments. Looking back, the strangest part wasn't the unknown identity of the intruder. It was how quickly an ordinary workday turned into one of the most unforgettable moments of my life. One moment, we were wasting time and looking for an excuse to leave the office. The next, we were hiding in a dark storage room, hoping a locked door would remain locked. Nothing dramatic happened in the end, but I still remember those slow knocks on the other side of the door. I thought the facility was empty, but then I saw someone moving in the restricted zone, and I knew we weren't alone. Most emergency alerts end with an email explaining what happened. This one ended with 3 police cars, a missing contractor, and a section of the building that nobody could account for. For nearly 2 hours, hundreds of employees remained trapped inside a distribution facility without knowing what was happening outside. I worked at a large distribution warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio. The facility was enormous, covering several acres and operating around the clock. I was working a late afternoon shift in inventory control when everything happened. The day had been completely ordinary up until that point. My coworker Brandon and I were finishing a stock audit near the rear section of the warehouse. Around 4 o'clock, every scanner in the building suddenly displayed the same message. Security protocol, in effect. Remain in your current area. That immediately got everyone's attention. The company rarely used full emergency procedures. Weather alerts happened occasionally, but those were announced differently. Within seconds, several large access doors automatically closed throughout the facility. The constant movement of people and equipment slowed to a stop almost instantly. Nobody nearby seemed to know why. At first, we assumed it was a drill. Then the overhead announcement came. The security manager instructed all employees to remain where they were until further notice. No explanation was provided, nor was a timeline given. The message simply repeated twice before cutting off. That was enough to make the situation feel more serious. The inventory area where Brandon and I worked sat beside a long storage corridor. Normally there was constant activity there throughout the day. Forklift traffic moved continuously between departments, and employees regularly crossed through on foot. Now the entire corridor sat empty. The silence felt unusual enough that we both noticed it immediately. About 15 minutes passed. People started checking internal messaging systems looking for information. Rumors spread quickly, but none of them matched each other. Some employees thought someone had entered the property through a security gate. Others believed there had been a problem involving a contractor working near one of the loading areas. Nobody seemed to know anything for certain. Eventually, Brandon suggested walking to the break room. It was technically within our assigned zone and only a short distance away. Several employees from nearby departments had already gathered there waiting for updates. Most people assumed the emergency alert would end any minute. On the way there, we passed a side corridor leading toward an older section of the warehouse. The lights were still on. Everything looked normal. But halfway down the corridor, I noticed someone walking away from us. The person wore a reflective safety vest and dark work pants. That wouldn't normally stand out in a warehouse environment. The strange part was that nobody should have been moving between sections during the emergency alert. Everyone had been instructed to stay put. The figure disappeared around a corner before either of us could get a better look. I pointed it out to Brandon. He shrugged and assumed it was maintenance. That seemed reasonable enough. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. When we reached the break room, roughly 20 employees were gathered there. Most sat quietly scrolling through their phones. A few supervisors were attempting to contact security for information. Nobody appeared alarmed, but there was definitely growing uncertainty. The longer the security protocols continued, the more people started paying attention. Nearly 30 minutes later, another announcement finally arrived. Security informed everyone that the security protocol remained active. Again, no explanation. That was when people began getting frustrated. Employees started discussing whether somebody had triggered a false alarm. Others wondered if law enforcement had been called. One supervisor mentioned seeing some official vehicle enter the property earlier. The conversation quickly shifted from curiosity to speculation. Nobody had reliable information. Then something happened that changed the mood completely. One of the warehouse managers entered the break room carrying a radio. His expression immediately caught everyone's attention. He asked whether anyone had seen a contractor wearing a reflective orange vest. Several people exchanged glances. I immediately remembered the person Brandon and I had seen earlier. The manager listened carefully as I described the corridor and direction. The room grew noticeably quieter. Apparently, the contractor had signed into the facility that afternoon. During the emergency alert, security attempted to verify everyone's location. They discovered one person couldn't be accounted for. No emergency existed, but they needed to locate him before reopening the building. That explanation relieved everyone slightly. At least there wasn't an active threat. Still, it raised a different question. Where had he gone? The warehouse was large, but it wasn't endless. A search team consisting of supervisors, security personnel, and maintenance staff began checking sections of the facility. Employees remained inside designated areas, while updates were shared periodically. The atmosphere changed from concern to curiosity again. Now everyone wanted to know where the missing contractor had disappeared. Nearly an hour later, the answer finally arrived. The contractor had accidentally entered a rarely used utility section during routine inspection work. A security door had closed automatically behind him when the security protocol began. Because that area had poor radio reception, he never received instructions and couldn't easily contact anyone. Meanwhile, security assumed he had moved somewhere else. He wasn't in danger. Neither was he hiding or trespassing for that matter. He simply became trapped in a forgotten section of the facility while everyone else searched for him. Once security located him, the emergency alert ended shortly afterward. Employees slowly returned to work while managers explained the situation. The contractor was embarrassed more than anything else. Apparently, he had spent nearly 2 hours trying to figure out why every nearby door remained locked. In the days that followed, facility management reviewed the entire incident and made several changes to prevent something similar from happening again. The contractor recovered quickly from the confusion and shock, but he later admitted that the experience had been far more overwhelming than he initially let on. Being trapped alone inside a dark section of a nearly empty building during a security protocol had left him completely disoriented, especially once his phone battery died and he lost track of time. Looking back, it's easy to see how a series of small oversights created a situation that seemed far more sinister than it actually was. The knocking happened at the exact same time every night, but what I saw through the peephole was far more unsettling than I ever imagined. During those quiet months, fewer than 30 people remained inside the residential complex where I lived. Every night, at exactly 9:30, someone knocked 3 times on my door. Whenever I opened it, the hallway was empty. For weeks, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Then one evening, I discovered who had been standing outside my room, and after I explain what happened, you'll understand exactly why I moved out less than a week later. A few years ago, I was living in a university-owned residential complex in northern Luzon while completing a postgraduate accounting program. Unlike standard student housing, the building mainly housed graduate students, researchers, and university employees, so everyone living there was well into adulthood. When campus security restrictions began, most residents immediately returned home to stay with family. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option for me, because transportation had become unreliable and my budget was already stretched thin. Like several others who remained behind, I settled into a routine and tried to make the best of the situation. The building felt completely different once most people left. Hallways that were normally busy became quiet for days at a time, and entire floors looked practically abandoned. The vending machines remained stocked, the lights stayed on, and maintenance workers still came through occasionally, but there were far fewer people around than before. At first, I actually enjoyed the silence because it made it easier to focus on my work. Over time, however, the quiet started making every small sound seem much more noticeable. Most of my days followed the same pattern. I attended online classes, completed assignments, and spent hours staring at spreadsheets or reports. Whenever I felt restless, I would leave the building and walk around the campus perimeter before returning to my room. The grounds were mostly empty during those months, which made the walks feel strangely peaceful. It wasn't unusual to go 15 or 20 minutes without seeing another person. One evening, while walking back from picking up takeout, I noticed a man sitting beneath a covered waiting shed near the entrance road. Because of the distance and fading light, I couldn't see him clearly. I assumed he was another resident getting fresh air and didn't think much of it. The next evening, however, he was there again in almost the exact same position. A few nights later, I noticed him once more. Eventually, I started recognizing him. He appeared to be in his 30s and usually wore a dark jacket with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He never approached anyone and never seemed to be doing anything suspicious. Still, I found it odd that he spent so much time sitting in the same location every evening. Since the property still had residents and staff moving through it occasionally, I dismissed the feeling and stopped paying attention. Several weeks later, a plumbing issue developed in my unit. A crack appeared behind part of the bathroom wall, and maintenance recommended moving me into another room while repairs were completed. The relocation wasn't difficult, because most of the building was empty anyway. Within a few days, I had transferred to a room on a different floor. The new unit was cleaner, quieter, and generally more comfortable. For about a week, everything felt normal. Then the knocking started. The first time it happened, I was reading at my desk when I heard 3 sharp knocks against the door. I opened it immediately, but no one was there. I assumed someone had knocked on the wrong door and walked away before I reached it. The incident barely registered in my mind. The following evening, however, the exact same thing happened at exactly 9:30. 3 knocks, an empty hallway, no explanation. After the 4th consecutive night, I started paying closer attention. The timing never changed. The man always showed up at 9:30. That consistency bothered me more than the knocking itself. Random behavior is easy to ignore, but routines usually have a reason behind them. I tried opening the door faster, waiting nearby before the usual time, and even checking the hallway through the peephole. Somehow, I never saw anyone. Weeks passed, and the situation continued. One weekend, I visited relatives living nearby and asked a friend named Alyssa to check on my room while I was away. When I returned, she immediately asked whether someone normally knocked on my door every evening. The question caught me completely off guard. Without me mentioning anything, she described the exact same pattern I had experienced. That was the moment I stopped convincing myself it was my imagination. Alyssa thought it might be another resident playing a prank. I wanted to believe that explanation too. Still, something about it didn't feel right. The building was nearly empty, and most remaining residents kept to themselves. Nobody seemed interested in wandering the halls every night for no reason. Once the possibility of a prank stopped making sense, I began paying much closer attention to my surroundings. Over the next several days, I started noticing small things. Whenever I left the building in the evening, I occasionally saw the same man from the waiting shed somewhere nearby. Sometimes he was sitting outside. Other times he was standing near a pathway looking at his phone. None of it was unusual on its own, but I couldn't ignore how frequently our paths crossed. The more I noticed him, the more uncomfortable I became. One evening, after finishing a walk, I entered through a side entrance instead of the main one. As I approached the elevator lobby, I noticed movement near the stairwell door. The same man stepped into the corridor, glanced in my direction, and immediately turned away. He wasn't doing anything threatening, but the reaction felt strange enough that it stuck with me. Something about the encounter felt rehearsed, like he hadn't expected me to arrive from that direction. That night, the knocking happened again. For the first time, I didn't open the door. Instead, I looked through the peephole. A figure stood directly outside. The moment he realized someone was looking through the door, he turned and walked quickly toward the stairwell. By the time I opened the door a few seconds later, he was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, finally understanding that the knocking hadn't been random after all. The next evening, I decided to test my suspicion. A few minutes before 9:30, I quietly stepped into a common study room located near the end of the corridor. The lights were off, giving me a clear view of the hallway without being easily noticed. Sure enough, the same man emerged from the stairwell shortly before the usual time. He approached my door with a calculated rhythm, knocking exactly 3 times. He didn't rush or leave. He stood there in the silence, seemingly waiting for a response that he knew wasn't coming. After nearly a minute, he looked around and headed back toward the stairwell. I waited until he disappeared before returning to my room. The following morning, I reported everything to building management. Since the residents kept visitor logs and access records, they reviewed recent entries and identified the individual. It turned out he wasn't a resident at all. He had been visiting a friend in the complex periodically and had apparently developed an interest in me after seeing me around the property during that period. Management immediately revoked his access privileges and notified the resident responsible for bringing him onto the property. Once it became clear that staff were aware of the situation, the man stopped appearing altogether. I never saw him in the waiting shed again. The nightly knocks ended immediately as well. In fact, the sudden silence was almost as noticeable as the knocking had been. After weeks of expecting that sound every evening, I found myself automatically checking the time whenever 9:30 approached. A few days later, I decided to move into another hostel. Part of me knew the problem had already been solved, but I couldn't shake the discomfort. The experience had changed the way I viewed the place. What once felt quiet and peaceful now felt isolating. Every empty hallway reminded me how long the situation had gone unnoticed. Even simple things like walking to the laundry room or taking the elevator late at night felt different than before. I no longer saw the building as a safe, familiar place. Instead, I found myself constantly paying attention to who was around me and where they were standing. Looking back, what unsettles me most isn't the man himself. It's how easily I explained away the warning signs, the strange routine, the repeated sightings, the knocking at the same time every night. The fact that he always seemed to be nearby whenever I left the building. At the time, each incident felt insignificant on its own, easy to dismiss with a logical explanation. Only afterward did I realize how all the pieces fit together. Thankfully, nothing worse happened. Even so, I still think about those 3 knocks whenever I find myself alone in a quiet building. Sometimes, all it takes is a simple sound at the same time every night to remind you how vulnerable you can be without even realizing it. If you'd like to hear more real-life horror, unsettling encounters, and creepy true stories that could happen to anyone, make sure to subscribe to Deep Horror. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment telling us which story disturbed you the most, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay aware of your surroundings, and we'll see you in the next one.